All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Professor Craig Belanger, and I am with Dr. David Brokaw, who is UAT's resident historian and all-around cool guy. And happy Constitution Day. We are going to talk about, in this particular annual discussion, we're going to talk about how technology, new technology, emergent technology can threaten, and maybe we can talk about how it can also bolster civil liberties that are ensconced in our Constitution. So that's going to be the topic for today. So welcome, Dr. Brokaw.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start with a broad question about technology in the Constitution. I'm going to ask you ultimately to speculate. Obviously, you can't know what was on the minds of the authors of the Constitution, but what do you think they might have either amended in the original Constitution, or what do you think that they might make of a lot of the advancements in technology that do today threaten civil liberties?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of the founders would have taken a deep interest in technology, especially people like Thomas Jefferson, who's always interested in the latest innovations.
Noted tinkerer and inventor, right?
Absolutely. I mean, people like Jefferson and Hamilton, I mean, they're just so intellectually and scientifically curious. They would have certainly been very fascinated with today's technology, I think. But aside from, I think, their immediate kind of curiosity and interest in the development of technology, their other primary concern is really related to a kind of balance of power with regard to the Constitution. And I think particularly what is one of the more interesting constitutional amendments, and probably one of the least appreciated or least talked about, at least kind of at large in public circles, is the Fourth Amendment. And what the Fourth Amendment was basically trying to accomplish is, in essence, protecting citizens against illegal searches and seizures of their property, basically protecting them from what they had already experienced at the hands of the British military, which was, basically the British military coming into their house, and performing a lot of these searches and even seizing, property at times if, they were suspected of something. But what that amendment really tried to do is really kind of provide a kind of protection against that. And so I think our question right now is, it's gotten so complicated because of where our current technology has sort of gotten us with our personal information. Because we share our personal information constantly, just almost out of necessity, online. So we share it with search engines. We share it with online banks. We share it with tons of websites that collect, cookies and all these things. So we share our information so widely and broadly online. And there's this question that hasn't really been settled yet, which is what is really a breach of those Fourth Amendment rights as it relates to sharing data online. And there is basically something called the third-party doctrine, which basically says that if you've shared your information with a third party, you're in essence out of luck. Like, well, it's kind of open season.
So in other words, you've signed a EULA or whatever, or something. You've offered the information voluntarily.
Right.
According to that third-party doctrine, then the joke's on you, consumer. Is that sort of the message?
Basically,
Okay.
that's basically it. And there have been a few exceptions. There's a court case actually that was decided a few years ago, Carpenter v. The United States, that went to the Supreme Court and actually determined that the police didn't have a right to his location data without having a warrant. But that was one single court case, and that's kind of like one exception that has come out recently. But in general, that third-party doctrine still stands, and where a lot of people are concerned right now. So, to kind of think back to sort of try to shift between our age and like the 1770s and 1780s, for example, right? It would be kind of like if the British military suspected that or heard that there was some crime committed in on the east end of Boston or something somewhere, right? And that they basically engaged in just like a whole scale like search of the entire east end of Boston, right? And went into people's homes and basically, was rifling through people's, personal, information and seeing if they could uncover any evidence for it, right? But unfortunately, that is in essence what has happened in this age of digital technology, where you see these huge data dumps where you see them basically acquiring just vast amounts of like location data, for example, on people who are on just innocent people, right? That there's no probable cause. They just happen to be in the area, right? But that is deeply troubling for some for some defenders of civil liberties, particularly related to the Fourth Amendment. And I think it's a very profound, complicated question that I think desperately needs more attention right now, and not just in the interest of kind of private civil liberties, but I think even as far as technology companies are concerned and technologists themselves, because we're in this weird middle ground, I think right now, where we have all these exciting new technologies, but there's also a lot of sort of cognitive dissonance with it too. Whether it's like, people saying like, oh, well, I don't want an Alexa in my home, right? They're listening to me, and they're hearing everything I say, and they're collecting data on me, and so on and so forth. And I think that if technology companies want to sort of bolster the confidence of consumers as well, I think that there needs to be more clarity on this issue, across the board. So I think in terms of, it's both a kind of civil rights, Fourth Amendment kind of issue, but you could also just see it from a kind of business and consumer perspective too. It's like, well, what can consumers expect? What can users expect with regard to privacy and data?
For sure. So let me ask you this. I mean, there is another side to this coin, which is I'll give an example of, say, public health. If the government was to use data that was taken in by the same means which you're talking about, maybe unbeknownst to citizens and consumers, maybe they're to buy the information on the data market from somebody, part of this sort of surveillance capitalism system that we've been talking about so much lately. But let's say that information is used to the benefit of the public good. For example, maybe something silly, maybe it's refrigerator data, or so many consumers have been purchasing ice cream in a certain area, and they can begin to see that and I apologize to the ice cream industry for this accusation, but they can see that public health is sort of failing, like people are getting less healthy. Maybe obesity rates are rising. Wouldn't it then be a good thing, and maybe it's a different question altogether if it's the government's job to do this, but to then institute maybe public health policies that that are targeted towards particular parts of the country, maybe geographically, they can see that, well, these people need a little bit more. And so what's your response to a question like that? Is that me putting too much faith in the will of government to use data? Do we have evidence that they are, in fact, trying to uphold our civil liberties with this material, or is it all sort of an encroachment against our civil liberties? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one. As far as decisions like that, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure how much more data we need on kind of junk food consumption.
It's a controversial example, I know.
But yeah, I mean, certainly there's, Americans can certainly make some better, dietary choices in general.
Different topic. Probably. Right. But data is data, right? And
yeah.
it if used correctly, I guess my point is it can be helpful using these same means, and even when it's and maybe I'm making a very naive argument about the goodwill of government to be able to use this, but it seems to me that it's not necessarily the technology that's the problem here. It's maybe the will of government, and also possibly the ignorance of the public that data is being used in a particular way.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's it. And honestly, I mean, digging into this topic more, and of course, I have a background in history. You have a background in English, but there is just such a need for this kind of interdisciplinary approach to a lot of these issues, because it's clear that even recently, I mean, if you watch like the congressional hearings on big tech and stuff like that, we just have so many politicians who just quite frankly don't really know what they're talking about when it comes to a lot of technology, and not that I necessarily do. Of course, there's a lot more people at UAT who have much deeper knowledge than I do, of course, on a lot of this technology. But it's just a reminder how we need experts from all these different fields to really come up with sensible kind of paths forward in terms of regulating it, in terms of protecting consumers and users. So we need people, we need constitutional scholars and legal experts, right, along with technologists who really understand how this technology is being used and sort of how it works and the ins and outs of it, to better regulate it and really kind of guarantee certain that certain rights will not be jeopardized.
Sure, and you can add in there the fourth estate of in technology, which would be the ethicists, right? You've got the consumers as well, the third, but then the fourth is ultimately the ethicists, and they would weigh in on this stuff. So you've actually bridged, kind of naturally to the next focus I wanted to go to with this, which is I have some information in front of me about a recent call to action to the Biden administration from the American Civil Liberties Union, and their concern is on how artificial intelligence, according to them, can deepen racial and economic inequities. Now, this is a major digital divide issue on a social level. We've seen these systematic issues, but now we're in a world where artificial intelligence, AI, can be used for all kinds of things, such as determining who's a good person to lend money to, who's a good person to sell a home to, et cetera. Now, the issue is this, that they are finding, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, NIST, also MIT and other research organizations have some fairly firm conclusions. They have found that some of the algorithms that drive things like facial recognition or these other financial tools may have some biases in them. Now, this is nothing new in terms of technological or technology development. Anytime a new technology is used or invented or modified, created, designed, whatever, there is a period of time where after we calm down from how amazing it is and what a miracle it is that this thing exists, we then begin the process of maybe looking for things that need to be corrected in the way it's used, right? It could be, dangerous or whatever. In this case, it looks like what's happening is that AI is the development of AI and the training of AI has developed some cracks in it in terms of, there's flaws about how data is fed into the machine. So the old programmer notion of garbage in, garbage out has come to fruition, where, for example, arrest rates, or for people of color, young African American males, for example, is probably one of the biggest examples with this case, are being incarcerated at higher levels, possibly as a result of being recognized from this technology. And the way that happens is that the technology itself is trained using insufficient data or flawed data that goes in that doesn't allow it to recognize maybe the differences among people with brown skin in the way that it does with people with lighter skin. And that ultimately puts us in this place. And now the ACLU is calling for the Biden administration to address this. They see this as a growing concern. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's just an immensely important topic right now. And yeah, it's one I spent some time discussing in my global issues class. We bring up the Algorithmic Justice League, which is based out of MIT, led by Joy Buolamwini, and this is one of her real primary concerns and the reason for the founding of that organization. But I think here again, it's the danger of technology reflecting social ills and social prejudice, and technology doesn't work in a vacuum, right? And certainly with regard to AI, where AI is built on data, like fundamentally, right? That's just as bare bones as a definition as you can get, right? But the data that is being used by algorithms often reflects social prejudices and discrimination, right? So what you end up kind of reproducing are social prejudices and discrimination, right? When the data itself is kind of skewed in that way, right? Where you have African Americans and Latin Americans overrepresented, for example, in the prison population, right? So you're going to have algorithms that kind of reproduce that, or you have men, for example, who are who are tend to be more at the top of a lot of corporations, and they tend to be the majority of CEOs and upper level executives. So when it comes to using AI technology to give people promotions, well, again, if the data is sort of is skewed toward that population already, it's going to sort of reproduce that result. So it's very important that we just enter into this age of AI, which we're already in, of course, but we do it much more consciously, and we do it with a lot more awareness and really a lot more sort of regulation around it, which of course some police departments around the United States, they've gone ahead and basically banned the use of AI technology in their police departments. There's Seattle, San Francisco, Boston. There's, I think, several others. But yeah, do we need a kind of federal, action at this point? Which
some sort of intervention for sure. Yeah,
is what the ACLU is calling for.
Yes.
And that is the thing, because AI is so utterly exciting and the benefits are so irresistible. I mean, you can potentially save people's lives, diagnose cancer earlier, so many things. But yeah, the kind of potential to reproduce prejudice and discrimination is absolutely a very real one. And it's already happening.
Yeah, for sure. And the premise of what they're asking here is that the Biden administration pay attention to this stuff and take action to correct it, because ultimately, some people could say, well, maybe we can handle this at lower levels, but these are civil liberties. These are federal rights given to us, or rights given to us by the federal government, by the Constitution, I should say, of the federal government, that are therefore, that therefore necessitates that the president, the executive, takes care of this. And personally, I would definitely agree that it needs to be looked into. Often, and perhaps I'm cynical about this, but I think you've already alluded to this idea that the companies themselves aren't necessarily, it's not always in their best interest to look into this kind of stuff, because what they're doing is they're having their successful developments of technology reinforced by the use by police, police organizations and others who need this information. And so they've got a good thing going, right? And yet, maybe it is time for someone to step in, and the general public can maybe vote by not purchasing these things, but this isn't really something that the general public is using. I don't know anybody who owns their own, facial recognition system other than what's on their phone, right? Their own, sort of, authentication for their devices, right? So this is a big deal, and it seems to warrant much more scrutiny at the federal level.
Yeah, definitely, and it speaks to, I mean, even the instances of, say, misidentifying someone, and particularly misidentifying people of color, which happens to be the case. A lot of it is because the technology hasn't reached that level of sophistication, and because of the data sets, it's not that great at differentiating people of color, and sometimes doesn't even identify them as people. That has also happened. So it's certainly there's a ways to go with the technology at this point, but I think it's fair to say that kind of from a kind of legal constitutional standpoint, that we need to sort of treat this kind of technology-based evidence with a fair amount of skepticism. And there's even someone in Phoenix. I was reading about this a few years ago, who was arrested for a crime that he did not commit, but it turned out that he had his dad's cell phone, and evidently his dad was guilty of the crime. But I mean, things like that, right, where you maybe have someone else's cell phone, or there's so many things that can happen where, if you're just basing it on this piece of evidence that is coming from from technology, whether it's like location information, or whether it's like facial recognition technology that is very imperfect. I mean, that type of evidence needs to be treated with a great deal of skepticism, still at this point. Not to say that it's, needs to be entirely like thrown out, but to kind of base someone's arrest solely around that, it's proven time and time again to be quite faulty.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're things have changed a little bit since we're coming up on the 20th anniversary, roughly, of the Patriot Act, and what that ultimately did. 10 years ago, people were broadly in favor of things like PRISM. There was a lot of public outcry, but in general, most people thought, well, these are good measures. Use the technology to catch terrorists, the bad guys. And yet, I think public opinion seems to be changing with things like facial recognition becoming, it's a lot more personalized. We were okay maybe 10 years ago, generally speaking, with the government reading our emails and getting into some of this stuff. But the ubiquity just wasn't there 10 years ago with all of these heavily personalized smart devices that have a lot more information than the old cell phones that we were using. And 10 years doesn't seem like a long time, unless you're talking about, technologically speaking, it may as well be a millennium, right? So, we're much further ensconced in our technology. We're almost one with our technology. All right, so we've got a limited amount of time here. I'd like to move on a little bit, and I'm gonna ask you a broad sort of philosophical question about human rights and civil rights, and it's this: should internet access be a protected right in the United States? The premise for this is the UN Human Rights Declaration of, I believe, 2016, that put internet access on the list of human rights. And the reason for this, obviously, they're very concerned about human development and our ability to succeed just on very basic levels. So, food and shelter and other things that we need to live are pretty obvious rights that they've granted, or that they believe should be granted by all governments to citizens. Now, internet access might seem like a little bit more of a luxury until you begin to think about the many ways that survival can depend on internet access in the 21st century. Just the ability to work, to get government information as needed, to communicate with others during COVID, for example. The Open Global Rights organization that I got some information from for this mentions how the need to be able to be educated, to work, and just have a social life at all during pandemic lockdown would have been vastly affected by the lack of internet access. And their conclusion, as well as the conclusions of myself and others, is that shows how important to existence internet access can be. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on sort of, where should we go with this? Can we make this into a civil right? Is that the kind of thing that we can do? Is there resonance in the other, in the Bill of Rights for something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I tend to agree. It's absolutely essential. In this day and age, and it's, it practically is a kind of human rights, civil right issue at this point, just because of how much needs to be done online, and I think that, thinking back even to say like the reform movement for education in the 19th century. It got to a point where reformers like Horace Mann and others understood that without a publicly supported education system, we're in essence kind of depriving people of their rights, depriving people of literacy, depriving people of social mobility, and all these things. And in many ways, internet access is tied to all that, now. So
try getting a job without applying online. They may have paper applications that are left over from the 90s, but just any job that you apply for these days is going to have the first door you see is digital.
Right. Yeah, and how do we guarantee that? Do we invest in a kind of publicly supported internet structure? I'm not sure. Obviously right now it is internet service providers kind of rule the roost, so to speak. But yeah, does it get to a point where we have to guarantee that access in a way that we guarantee access to, say, public education, where everyone can have access to at least K through 12 education. Then after that, it's kind of up to them. But everyone has that right, and in many ways, I see internet access is really just as essential. And of course, the way education is continuing to develop, it's they're so intertwined now. It's really hard to separate. So
yeah, and I think the way that a lot of people would envision this is maybe declaring the internet a public utility,
right,
or the World Wide Web, I guess, as a public utility, and therefore it becomes protected. You must have clean water running through those internet pipes. That's kind of what you're looking at. Now, that also does open the door. I could imagine critics looking at that and saying, well, you get the internet or you get the government involved in that, then there's this whole level of regulation that might be further encroaching on maybe not civil liberties, but corporations and those who have to run this stuff. So I can understand the criticism on the other side of it, but it is an interesting sort of philosophical question for our time. And certainly the UN's vision is not necessarily worried about privileged Americans or people in developed nations necessarily. Their concerns are much more global, and as we understand, the global picture of this is very different once you leave most areas in the United States. Although to be fair, there's a lot of areas in the United States that are just as impoverished technologically as anywhere else around the world. In some cases, maybe even more so on average. All right, so last topic, let's just take a couple minutes here. And I'm going to ask you, we're going to go into science fiction land here. And I'm going to ask you if you can ever imagine a time when sentient beings who are not human will be given civil rights. What do you think?
I think it's possible.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
I think it's possible.
We offer rights to there are animals that we protect. And we give them rights, so to speak, not in the sense that we care if they marry or can, own a home or any of that, have those protections, but they are legally protected once they're given rights, So let's go down the speculation path just a little more specifically. When do you think this might happen?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, part of where my brain goes with some of this is I think back to, essentially the late 19th century, where corporations start to argue successfully that they have 14th Amendment rights and in essence have constitutional rights, right, as a business, as a company. So, for me, in some ways, like, we already have some kind of form of that because, like, a business is not technically and literally a person. It's made up of people, but it's not in and of itself a person. So I think, the extension of that, we've already kind of extended that, quite a while ago to businesses. So, I could see in the future, constitutional rights veering in that direction, quite seamlessly almost.
Sure. If we have, there's lots of questions in here, and I like to talk about this kind of stuff with both my science fiction students and my ethics and technology students, and we'll pretty much have the same conversation. But you're right, there's precedent for this already, and maybe we could look at a corporation as sort of a dumb variation of AI, where it's its algorithm is basically helping it raise revenues. Like that's its function, and all of its kind of mentality goes towards that. But that would not really be any different from the worker bots that we already have, that are in fact in some cases replacing people. But ultimately, the concern here is if and when, and some people really believe in the when part of this, these things begin to show some sort of self-awareness or to display themselves as relevant, practically human, except maybe in form, things to care about, right? Maybe at that point we should begin to include them in our, under the umbrella of civil rights. And it involves notions of personhood, both, I guess, philosophically, spiritually, legally, is when it matters. It's an interesting question, and one that, if you had given me a year, 2049, I would be very suspicious. So I think you handled that one pretty well. It's a wildly speculative question, but kind of fun to worry about nonetheless. We you think of Rachel from Blade Runner, which is it's a conundrum because, well, yeah, she's a machine. She's built for a particular efficiency and set of functions. And, some people will say, well, it doesn't matter because technically this is a machine. And yet Rachel believes she is human. And shouldn't that matter?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And, if you don't think it matters constitutionally, we do have protections for the pursuit of happiness, and the machine wants happiness, right? Then it must be protected. And so then questions of its legal, legal remedies to not getting happiness for whatever reasons, or, it gets called into question, and I think we can entertain it. But it's still science fiction.
Yeah, well, where my mind goes, I guess. I mean, I could see it from the perspective of like business interests, and business interests arguing that yes, they do have rights and protections, because the companies who are producing like replicants, let's say, I could see them absolutely arguing that because it's in their interest. I mean, they want to protect their product.
So the Constitution is the ultimate end user license agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
You must upgrade. It's a constitutional protection, the right to be upgraded.
Right? Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's scary to think of it that way, but
It is, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was scary to think of automated, vehicles and AR and other things that were just pure science fiction then. This is why we talk about it, right?
yeah, totally.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to thank you for your time, and I'm going to wish you again happy Constitution Day, and take care. It's always fun talking to you about this kind of stuff.
Thanks, Greg.
All right. Take care.